This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Weijian Shan. He is a Chinese economist, businessman, and author based in Hong Kong. He's the CEO of the private equity firm, PAG. I don't want to misquote the assets under management, but I believe right now, at this moment in time, it's 40 billion. Before PAG, Weijian was with TPG Capital. For those of you that are not familiar with TPG Capital, pull out your Wikipedia right now and take a peek. Bottom line, my guest today knows something about private equity. He knows something about deal making, and he shares those experiences with me. And what's so cool about Weijian's story is it starts in China. It makes its way to America, but it starts in China. It starts in a period in time in China, the 50s and 60s, when things were a little chaotic. And he gets in deep. He shares his insights. I am forever grateful to have this podcast, to have the opportunity to talk to individuals that I never would have had a chance to communicate with, to share with, for him to share with me, for him to share with you. How lucky are we to get behind the scenes and have that perspective? Because instead of hearing all of the names that are often said about China, some good, some bad, I can promise you this. I've been to mainland China many times. When I go to mainland China, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of America. Now, if you're an American right now and you've never been to mainland China, you probably think I'm crazy. Well, maybe it's time for you to get to mainland China and check it out. Without any further delay, let's jump into this great conversation with Weijian Shan and learn something. Truly learn something about China and his story of amazing success. I hope you enjoy this conversation. My first time coming to Hong Kong, 2006. Great experience. And then I came back to Singapore 2008, I think. I'd been to Tokyo in there. I did not get a chance to get to Beijing, mainland China, until 2013. And I had a chance to speak before a very large audience. Everyone was so friendly. It was so great. I was the only white guy there. It was a fantastic experience. And then again in 2015, again in 2019. I mean, a couple of my favorite experiences, just to share really quick. I had a chance once to give a presentation to 1,000+ people in Beijing, mostly older female investors. It was so much fun. I mean, I got treated like a rock star. And I was this guy writing quant books. You know, I'm not even sure they knew exactly who I was, but they were so nice, so friendly. And it was such a wonderful experience to speak before 1,000 people. But the other thing I have to share with you, which was really fun for me, back in 2013, I got a chance to speak in China Asset Management offices. Private group, all their top guys, me telling about my quant books. It was one of those routines where I speak English 30 seconds, my translator goes Chinese for 30 seconds. So we do this for 30 minutes. At the end of the 30 minutes, I say, okay, are there any questions? The lead guy at China Asset Management looks at me and goes, yeah, I got a bunch of questions. I start laughing because everybody in the room clearly knew English, but I still had to go through the whole process. Maybe a few people didn't know English, but that was such a great experience as an American to kind of just feel that sense of like, hey, you're on our home turf. So I've had this great experience, and I told you some about me coming to Asia. So that's been my nice experience. And I wish so many of my fellow Americans had a chance to not just listen to the TV, not just read the papers, but to go, because there's something different that happens to you when you're on the ground, right?
Absolutely. Nothing can substitute for it.
Yeah. I mean, now see, you've done it both. I mean, obviously you're a guy that grows up in China, a very interesting time period. Let's talk, though, very big picture before I take you into some of your history about misconceptions. I think one of the best things that I saw in the last 4 years was when the Chinese leader went to, I think it was Mar-a-Lago with Trump, and Trump's little granddaughter sang, I think, a Chinese song. And I thought that was such a nice moment. And here we are now, 4 years later. Maybe we've lost that moment, huh?
I think so. It seems to be the case. But you're talking about government to government. I suppose the relationship at this particular moment is very bad, perhaps worse ever since Richard Nixon visited in 1972. But at the people level, that is people to people, I don't see any change. I think people are very friendly on both sides. They like to deal with each other, work with each other. I think that's just human nature. And that I don't see any change at all. Just like the experience that you had, I think if you go back there today, you would have similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, every time I'm in mainland China, I mean, everyone is nice to me. Everyone is nice to me.
Yes. And I feel the same way when I visit America. Everybody is very friendly, very nice. I met with many very generous people, very friendly people, very warm people in my life in America. And of course, I have numerous friends over there.
Your story is pretty amazing. I don't know if you ever just kind of say to yourself, I've been on a journey.
Well, I didn't have any choice when I lived my life. For much of my life, I just did whatever came my way.
But not everybody makes decisions like you. Let's take it back in time to you as a young person. Look, China's changing rapidly as you're a young person in 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, things are changing dramatically. What was it about you, do you think? Was it an influence from family, friends? But what about you was allowing you to make good decisions and to keep your eye on the ball on some larger future prize, which when you were in the Gobi Desert was probably hard to imagine?
I wouldn't give myself so much credit for making the right decisions. I provided an account of my life in the Gobi Desert as a hard laborer between 1969 and 1975. I was sent to the Gobi Desert without any choice at all. I and my peers were simply sent over there to do hard labor. And there was no hope when we were there to ever get out. There was never enough to eat. And of course, it was extremely cold in wintertime and extremely hot in summertime, the desert weather, as you know. Every day we had to work 10, 12, sometimes even 16 hours. At one time, I worked 31 hours straight, as I described in my book. There was no choice. It was not that you can make a decision or you could make a decision to do something else. And there was no hope of ever getting out. I think what saved me is that I was curious by nature, and I kept reading things, even though books were banned during that period of time. I was able to collect some books here and there from the peasants, from the farmers, just read it, whatever I could lay my hands on. So eventually, when China began to change, that is, the Cultural Revolution was over, and China resumed the college system and eventually went on the path of a market economy, I suppose I was just more prepared than most of my peers who didn't read in 10 years because the school was shut down when the Cultural Revolution started. It didn't resume until about 10 years later. A whole generation of people, like myself, were literally lost. I refer to my generation as a lost generation because there was no education. I was able to accumulate some knowledge. So when this ordeal was over, I was able to capture some opportunities. That's all.
I'm sure there's a little bit more than that's all, but let me speak to the curiosity part for a moment, though, because maybe that is something that was different about you. You mentioned your peers perhaps were not trying to find the same information from peasants and some of the readings you could get from them. And I think you mentioned also you had a chance to listen to the Voice of America at various points in time and to learn English in a unique way. But why were you curious? Was it something from early in life, from family? Would you think it was just natural that you had this spark even though in these very harsh situations that you described, you were still curious when maybe other people were not.
Well, I think man by nature is curious. Some people are more curious than others, but everybody is curious. I think it's a combination of curiosity and hard work. I did study very hard.
Give me the shift. China comes out of a certain period of time. You do get a chance to get education. Give me the pivot to where you get to America. How did that happen?
I studied for a number of years in Beijing after I got out of the Gobi, and my major was English. I began to teach English and English literature after I graduated from sort of a college. By that time, there was no formal college system, so I never received a bachelor's degree. And then I was able to take an exam for a program to train simultaneous interpreters for the United Nations as administered by some UN agency. And then a foundation in the United States by name of the Asia Foundation came to China to recruit visiting scholars. And I took exams and I was recruited. So I was given the opportunity, or I captured the opportunity to go to America either to become an interpreter for the United Nations or to become a visiting scholar. I chose the latter. The rest was the history of my study in the United States. I received my formal education really in the United States, not so much in China. I only studied about 3 years English in China. That was my formal education after elementary school. For 10 years, I was out of school. I have never had secondary education.
I like to think, based on my own observation across Asia, that, and maybe America had this at one time, but I think there's always a merchant perspective, a selling perspective in Asian people, which I love because I have it. So I feel at home. Was that part of your family and upbringing? Was there a merchant feeling, or were you more coming from an academic side only?
Neither. My parents probably received no more than elementary school education, but in the Chinese tradition, back in history, merchants were considered to be the lowest class, behind peasants, workers, behind, of course, officials, then farmers, workers, then merchants. In the Chinese tradition, business people are not considered to be high in the social hierarchy. Actually, they occupy a very low position in social hierarchy. I grew up with that notion because I read Chinese history books. I never considered myself at that time to have a future in business at all. It was after I went to America, I could only stay there for 1 year because that's what the program was. It's given to me by the Asia Foundation. And I discovered to obtain a degree during my short stay, I could only study business. So that's how I went into what you call merchant career, went into business education.
So many twists and turns, right? Just eyes wide open, opportunities present, and you go down the path. You end up teaching at Wharton, and then you end up moving on to JP Morgan. That was the real pivot to business, right?
Correct. I was teaching at Wharton. I taught there for 6 years, but thought it would be more interesting to practice what I preached. So I thought that I should get into business. When opportunity beckoned, that is, I received an offer from JP Morgan, I decided to seize it. And that's how I became a banker from a business professor.
Talk to those early experiences, though. Coming into your whole life's history is behind you. That's how you've got to the point where you're at JP Morgan. I mean, you're talking about teaching English, an English educational background, translating, the UN, Wharton. I mean, it's like shift. Or did you see these things as all related?
Only in one way. And that is my philosophy in life is to be always prepared. Because as I said, when I was growing up in China, there were not many choices. In fact, there was no choice at all. My thinking was that I should just study and prepare myself. If one day some opportunity arises, if I fail to capture it, then that's my fault. If I spend the rest of my life in the Gobi without any opportunities, I have nobody to blame. I certainly will not blame myself. So, with this philosophy in mind, I just try to continue to study, even to this day. And therefore, when opportunities presented themselves, I was able to capture some of them. I think that's true for everyone. If you're prepared, come across opportunities here and there, if you're prepared, you will be able to capture it. For example, you wrote your books, did your study, and toured Asia at the invitation of the investment bank. You see opportunities, and finally you decided to settle down here in Asia. It's the same thing.
You're right. It is the same thing. It's sometimes hard to explain to people, though. I'm sure you have people you know in China that look at your career and they just kind of scratch their head and they don't understand it all, but you just explained it all. It's very clear. Here's the opportunity. Okay, that makes sense. I'm going that way. But you have to jump. You either developed or learned how. And I know early on you say, okay, I had to. I had no choice. Once you got to America, you became quite comfortable with the idea of jumping.
That is correct. America is truly a land of opportunities. I mean, in America, I think the opportunities are wide open. At the time, I was comparing the differences between China and the United States. In China, opportunities were not equal. The results when I was growing up were more or less equal. Everybody earned about the same amount. Everybody was poor, but there was not a big gap. There's not big disparity in income among the population. So the results were quite equal in China, but opportunities were not. Some people were able to stay in the cities, others were sent to the countryside. Some people were assigned to be doctors or teachers, and others as farmers and peasants. So opportunities were very different. In America, it's the opposite, or was the opposite when I first arrived there, as I discovered. Opportunities were equal. Everybody could become anything, anybody. The results were not necessarily equal. Some people become very successful, others less so. I think I was very happy to have landed in America, which is the land of opportunities. Now China has opened up very much since 1980s, and now China more or less offers equal opportunities, and people can become very successful, people can choose what they do. So it's a changed world, and that's very different from 30 years ago or 40 years ago, before China started economic reforms and open door policy.
I wonder if you ever consider, as a Chinese man, talking about opportunities being equal in America and observing that statement, which seems perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational, perfectly logical, and perfectly believable, and perfectly true to me. But if you insert what you just said into the body politic in America, opportunities are equal. Oh my gosh, 50% of the heads in America might spin. But here you are as a Chinese immigrant saying, hold on, this is great. Look at all these equal opportunities.
I think you're right. That statement cannot be taken into extreme. I think you have to recognize that there is disparity income distribution in the United States. And you have to recognize that there are underprivileged people who perhaps don't feel that they have equal opportunities. But at a certain level, I would think that anybody can get almost anywhere. Just look at Obama, for example, coming from a very poor family, single parent. He studied very hard, eventually went to Harvard, I suppose, to get his law degree and became a senator, eventually president of the United States, coming from very bottom to the very top in society. So it is possible. Not everybody will be able to make it, but I think there's a possibility over there. The same cannot be said in many other countries in the world. I think that's the difference. I wouldn't make that statement in the extreme to say that anybody are at equal footing. No, you have to struggle. You have to work very hard. You have to get out of your shell. You have to try to make it. I think that would make the difference.
I don't think anybody in America alive currently has the Gobi Desert story. Many people have not walked your shoes. I concur with you I do think it is the land of equal opportunity. And I do think your story is a great example of overcoming adversity. Look, you're right. Not everyone's situation is equal. Gosh, what else do we got? All you can do is take what's been given to you. And you just gave me a great example with your story in the desert. You have to make do, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. Hey, before I shift into your private equity pivot, I'm curious if we might talk for a moment about back to misconceptions, and specifically American misconceptions of China. I understand them because I've had a chance to go to China some. I sometimes get very frustrated when I listen to Americans, American media, and American politicians. It seems like the same old trope, the same old kind of caricature of China. Maybe people think they're criticizing the Chinese government, but it often just sounds like they're criticizing all of China. How do we get around that? How do we get people to understand that China is not just this one-size-fits-all negative stereotype that so many Americans have?
I think it's very hard to do so. And it has to do with the media. I think that if you compare China with the United States, China is an authoritarian system. In the authoritarian system, very few people criticize the government, but very few people believe the government either. That's just the nature of it, because there's no free press, there's only one voice. People have grown used to being skeptical, and they try to look beyond the surface, ask questions, and try to get answers by themselves. Whereas in the democracy, in the free society, there is free press. Many people criticize the government, but many people also believe the government. And that's the most bizarre thing from my point of view. Because you believe you have free press, you don't try to be skeptical and ask questions. It turns out that many in the press, in the media, are not critical, because these days, as I have found, earning clicks for your articles as a reporter is critically important. Your newspaper stays in business depends on whether or not people read your articles. So the media tends to cater to popular sentiment. When that is the case, all of a sudden you find that there's very little critical examination of facts. And people tend to would like to believe, and newspapers would report what they think people would like to hear. So I think that situation is likely to persist. And in order to understand a different culture and different people, different country, people will have to do what you did. That is traveling around, talking with people, immerse yourself in the society. Then you can truly learn. But then you will have to invest your time and resources to be able to do so. I think you are a great bridge in understanding between different peoples. You understand America, you understand many of the Asian countries. You speak with authority. You can help bridge any misunderstanding between the countries.
You know what I always thought when I've been in mainland China? I don't speak the language, but I always had this feeling of everyone's kind of acting like they're Americans. There's that same kind of almost, and maybe you're going to disagree with me, but I almost had this sense of all the Asian countries, the way people carry themselves, the way they go about their life, China feels like America.
You're absolutely right in that regard. I often say that if you look at China and Japan, you would find there's so much similarity in many things that the Japanese people do and the Chinese people do. For example, Japan adopted the Chinese language. And even to this day, the Japanese language has hundreds of Chinese characters. If you look at the Japanese culture, the architecture, the writing, the poem in ancient times, they took their roots from China. But the cultural difference between China and Japan is very big. But there's great similarity between the Chinese culture and American culture today. Even the language itself. For example, the Chinese language, the sentence structure goes subject, verb, and objects. The Japanese language, even though it uses Chinese characters, goes subject, object, and verb, right? It's different sentence structure. And when it comes to being very open to foreigners. I think there's great similarity between China and the United States. And that's the most interesting thing. When I first went to America, that's what I immediately discovered.
I wouldn't say this in a negative way because I really enjoy my time when I'm in Japan. But if you are going to Japan as an outsider to walk away with friends that you might keep up with, it's going to be very difficult in Japan. It's not going to be difficult in China or Singapore or Malaysia or Vietnam. So Japan is very different.
I think it has to do with the fact that China is a continent, whereas Japan is more of an island historically. But now, of course, Japan has become more and more open. Historically, it was much more isolated. Who knows? We just know that there are cultural differences between the different countries. Not good or bad, it's just differences.
One last point before we shift into private equity. The word communism for Americans is really difficult for them to wrap their arms around because it goes back to Cold War, USSR, etc. Today, when Americans think of communism, if they think of China, they think of Vietnam, they have this visceral something, a negative connotation. But I tell you what, when you stand in the financial district in Shanghai and you look at those towers, the last thing you're thinking, the very last thing you're ever possibly thinking, even if it's true, is communism.
I fully agree with you. If you look at the Chinese economic system, it's more capitalistic than the United States. China doesn't have as developed a social security system as the United States, certainly not as the Nordic countries. To a large extent, China is at an early stage of capitalism. I'll tell you a story. There was a joke many years ago when Deng Xiaoping first started his economic reforms. The joke was there was a crossroad. Chairman Mao Zedong, drove a car and came to this particular point. And there were two arrows. One says socialism, and that's on the left-hand side. There's road on the left-hand side. And the other arrow points to capitalism. That's on the right-hand side. And Chairman Mao expectantly turned on the left signal and turned left. And the next came Gorbachev. He came to this particular point and he turned right. That was perestroika, glasnost, as you remember, in 1980s. He wanted reforms. He turned right. And Deng Xiaoping also came to this particular point, and he turned on his signal to turn left, but he went right. So that probably will tell you what China is. There's talk about communism, but in practice, in my view, China is doing everything in line with the market economy. I think they would admit it. They would say that market is the decisive force for allocation resources. And China has been successful in the past 40 years of economic growth, largely because China has moved in the direction of the market, a market economy. It is the invisible hand of Adam Smith, which really guided China into economic prosperity and growth.
Let's stay with the invisible hand because you leave JP Morgan, you go to Newbridge Capital, private equity firm, TPG. There happens to be a guy who started that company, a guy named David. I'll let you run with it. When did you meet him for the first time? And can you speak to any early mentoring experiences?
Well, David Bonderman you referred to was the founder and chairman of TPG, a major private equity firm in the United States, of course. And at the time, as I described in my new book, Money Games, I was at JP Morgan. David Bonderman and Dick Blom, who runs also a private equity firm, and jointly set up a private equity firm for Asia called Newbridge Capital. They wanted to recruit a co-head for Asia, and then they spoke with me. At the time, I didn't know anything about private equity, but it was a time of crisis in Asia. In late 1997, Asia was hit by the Asian financial crisis. The capital market froze. Hang Seng Index dropped 16% in one day. and capital market was more or less shut down. And I thought there was really no future for investment banking anytime soon. And I was persuaded to join Newbridge Capital, which was considered to be on the buy side, to make investments, to buy assets. And of course, in the economic crisis, it was a good time to buy assets whose prices came down very substantially. After meeting with David Bonderman and Dick Blum in late 1997, I decided to join Newbridge Capital. And I started my career in private equity ever since then.
Those early days, those early deals, two banks in particular, you've become quite known for, two very big deals. And I tell you, we should put in context how bad that crisis was, 97 through 99, before the dot-com implosion even. I still can go to KL today. I can go to Bangkok today. I'm guessing probably the same in Jakarta, but there are still unfinished 80-story towers in Bangkok and KL from that time period.
That is correct. More than 20 years later. Yes, it was devastating. It was devastating. Economies from Korea all the way down to Indonesia, from Japan to Southeast Asia, were all decimated. The economy dropped double digits, negative GDP growth for the year 1997 and 1998. And in Korea, many banks failed, as in Japan and Southeast Asia. So it was very devastating crisis, and people were struggling. It was a very bad time. And the aftermath of that crisis, as you say, is felt to this day. Although I think Asia fared much better in 2008, 2009 in the global financial crisis, because many of the Asian countries, if not all of them, have learned a good lesson from the 97-98 financial crisis, that is 10 years before 2008 global financial crisis, shored up their banking system, managed the risks, and therefore they weathered the storm of 2008, 2009 global financial crisis much better than even the developed countries.
I want to remind everybody, there are two books that you have authored here in the last couple of years now. Money Games, which we're going to talk a little bit about right now, but also Out of Gobi, My Story of China and America, which I've kind of brought up here at the beginning. People are really going to have to go dig in and go dive deep for the real granular details. But let's speak to your newest book. Let's speak to this, as you refer to it, Korea's most iconic bank, because this is a deal that when you put a deal like this together, and I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, not to be overly praiseworthy, but when you put a deal like this together, and of course there was a lot of people on your team and whatnot, but when a deal like this happens, to come in an American private equity firm and to help rescue a major Korean bank and to exit from that deal and see the profits, it's kind of a legendary type trade. You're no longer the young kid in Gobi. You're no longer working for the UN. You're no longer a professor at Wharton. You're no longer at JP Morgan. You've now pulled off and helped to pull off one of the great deals of modern finance.
I did, together with my team and working together with my partners. It was an unusual time, and I was new to private equity. So I had to do the deal while learning about doing deals. Without the team, without my partners, of course, I couldn't have been successful. So it was very much a team effort, but it was an unusual time. The bank in question that I described in my book, Money Games, went under. It was nationalized by the government. And Korea was in very difficult time at the time. Korea was quickly running out of foreign exchange reserves. It was at verge of defaulting on its sovereign debt, was running out of money, hard currency. IMF, the World Bank, came in and eventually provided a rescue package of $58 billion. At the time, it was a huge amount. It was the largest sum that the World Organization gave to a country ever. The Korean government, as part of that package, promised to sell at least one of the two banks to foreign investors in order to bring in credit culture, which was lacking in Korea, which was the reason why so many banks, more than 100 banks, failed during the Asian financial crisis. We showed up at the right time, under the right circumstances. We had the capital, we had the experiences, especially the knowledge that David Bonderman and my partners accumulated by investing into America's saving and loan crisis about 10 years earlier. So armed with that knowledge, armed with the capital, we were able to do a deal with the Korean government to buy a failed nationalized bank from the government. And eventually we turned it around and made it very profitable. It was unusual circumstances, and we happened to be there at the right time, at the right place.
People are going to have to check out the book because it's a blow-by-blow, granular dive in. And I love those kinds of books. I mean, there's only been a handful of really great ones like that over the years where you can really kind of understand behind the scenes how something like this went down. You mentioned David again there. Is there something you can share? Is there a big picture? You've given so many great life lessons from your own perspective today. Is there something you can share about David that you learned from him that would be an interesting one to pass along to my audience? He's probably not an investor or financier that many people know his name right off the bat. They probably don't, but he's a quick Wikipedia search will give some details that says he's kind of figured a few things out. What can we take away from his financial prowess, his skill? What was the big takeaway for you?
David Bonderman, as I mentioned, was founder of TPG, a private equity firm, a major private equity firm.
Huge.
In the United States, yes, with probably more than $100 billion under management at this particular point. He was a lawyer by training. He worked for Justice Department. He is extremely smart. He's one of the smartest people I have ever met in my life. Somehow, when he was working for Justice Department, he was spotted by Robert Bass in Texas and became the CIO, Chief Investment Officer of Bass Organization. And he did many great deals, including acquisition of American Savings Bank, which failed during the S&L crisis in late 1980s. He turned around airlines, Continental Airlines, made it very successful investments. So he became legendary in the private equity world. And he's a very smart man. He's also very easygoing, very humorous. I liked him when I first met with him. He has a lot of knowledge in private equity. When we were working on the Korea bank deal, of course, we borrowed the knowledge that he had when doing the American Savings Bank deal. I considered him to be the commander-in-chief in that particular transaction. And I was on the ground, and I took instructions from him almost on a daily basis, and we worked on that deal together. It was great pleasure working with him, as with all of my partners.
Well, you've also obviously gone on to start your own firm, and your own firm is not small as well today. People can check more information out online about your company and whatnot. Can I take you back in time, though, still? There's so many great stories from your early years. You say something about bullshit in your writings. You kind of remark about how Americans will use this term bullshit. But to you, growing up, experiencing some hard times, bullshit was no laughing matter. Bullshit was not something funny. Bullshit was very important to your life.
And that is correct. By the way, my firm is PAG. Now we manage about $40 billion, $40 billion, and we invest throughout Asia. But in the days when I was working as a hard laborer in the Gobi Desert, in wintertime, it was extremely cold, and there was no fuel. There was no source of heating. And the only fuel that we had was cow manure, dried cow manure. We painstakingly spent our hours and hours scavenging in the desert, collecting dried cow manure. A bonfire built from cow manure would give us some heating to allow us to remove our clothes, to go under the cover at night to sleep. Without it, in temperatures -10 or 20, it was exceedingly difficult even to remove one piece of garment. I always have very fond memories of bonfire built from cow manure. When I first went to America and I discovered people don't agree with you, they say bullshit. And I used to think to myself, that thing used to be very dear to me.
Obviously, your company, as you mentioned, managing 40 billion today, and you probably think, gosh, why is this guy Mike so interested in the cow manure from all those years ago? Because ultimately, I think on these kinds of conversations, my job is to try and pull from a guy like you who's had all these great experiences. Yes, tremendous success today. Okay, but I want to know the foundation. I want to know what made you, what was those experiences? Because that's the inspiration, right? It's hard for the average person sitting out there right now to be inspired in the sense that if you say, okay, you guys are managing 40 billion today, that's so big. But I think when people break it down and say, okay, you start at the bottom, your thinking has to build. I love those stories. I mean, I'm sure I'll never have another conversation with anyone on this podcast who is valuing bullshit in that sense. So, I mean, it's important. I think it's important to set the foundation. And I'm sure you feel that way because you would not tell people that story. I mean, I can tell talking to you, I think you probably can take your mind back immediately in seconds to those early experiences in your life. And they probably ground you every day, don't they?
Not every day. You don't think about it every day. Neither do you forget it.
It's your grounding.
Yes. You don't think about it, but you don't ever forget it. That's how I would say about it. When you have experienced hardship in life, it seems that nothing is tough. Nothing is tougher. I mean, in my book, I described the triumphs and tribulations of that particular deal. By the way, there were books about private equity, but there's really no book about a private equity deal from beginning to the end, the full investment cycle, the deal-making part, the turnaround of the business after the investment, the eventual sale or exit from the investment. There's no such a book, especially not one told by an insider who went through that experience, who participated in that process. So in that process, of course, there was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of hardship. And at one time, as I describe in the book, I worked 43 hours straight without sleep. Now, in my Gobi days, the longest time I worked digging a canal was 31 hours. But in Korea, I worked 43 hours straight without stop. And it was hard. But thinking about the tougher time that I had in the Gobi, it felt not so hard. When we were working in Korea, camped out in the Sheila Hotel, we could order room service at any time. Food was plenty. And that to me was a privilege. It didn't feel so hard. So I suppose if you have experienced the hardship, nothing is so hard anymore.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. I appreciate you saying it like that. Hey, one last question, big picture question. Today, how do you think about the global economy right now today? How do you think about where we are at this point in time, hopefully coming out of the COVID situation in the not too distant future? But how do you feel about everything? Where are we?
At this particular moment, of course, the global economy is under a lot of stress, the lockdown-induced stress. The only country that has come out of it definitely is China. In the second quarter of this year, China's economy went up 3.2%. In the first quarter, it came down 6.8%, but it resumed growth in the second quarter. In July, Chinese exports went up 7.2%, and in August, 9.5%. So China is clearly out of the woods and is recovering fairly strongly. Same cannot be said for the rest of the world to varying degrees. So I wouldn't think that the world economy outside of China will pull out of this virus-induced recession until probably sometime next year. But eventually, I think we'll come out of it, especially when the vaccine comes out. But the recession has caused a lot of damage, which cannot be repaired overnight. It will take some time for the world economy to get back to its footing.
Sir, I appreciate you taking some time today. This is fun chat. I could probably just pick your mind for all kinds of things here and there for hours. But you've got to get back to work and you've got to get back on with life. 2 books, Money Games, the inside story of how American dealmakers saved Korea's most iconic bank. Also, your first one, Out of the Gobi, My Story of China and America. Hey, 2 great books people should check out, especially if they happen to be outside of China or outside of Asia and they want to learn more and they want to dive in. You've done a great job of bringing us all in.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Hey, is there a website we can send people to? Do you want to direct people to anywhere or they can just go find you? You're easy to find online.
You can find the book or the books on Amazon and also on Book Depository. And I discovered that Book Depository ships worldwide for free. And Amazon, of course, is where you can find both of the books.
Well, listen, again, I appreciate you taking the time today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope my questions kept you engaged for our full hour.
Indeed. And it's a great pleasure talking with you, Michael.
Hopefully we can meet up one day in Hong Kong.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.